All right, hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still on hold for a while longer, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So, welcome to Russ's Rockin Rollercoaster Season 4, intriguing interviews with creative minds. So, I'll be doing a bit of a different show tonight, as some of you may remember. December 26th, 1996, America was taken hold by a story that lingers to this day. In Boulder, Colorado, little JonBenet Ramsey, just 6 years old at the time, was found murdered in the basement of her family home. She had a broken skull and had been strangled. It was a shocking crime with a long list of suspects, and yet even now, 25 years later, her killer has never been caught. To discuss the intricacies of the crime and the impact it had on America, please welcome back my friend Mark Olshaker, who, along with real-life FBI profiler John Douglas, wrote the seminal book Mindhunter, which became the incredible Netflix series of the same name. Mark is also an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker and author of 12 nonfiction books, including Einstein's Brain and the Edge. Mark is also past president of the Norman Mailer Society and a director of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Russ. How are you?
Okay, great. And great to see you again.
Thank you.
All right, as a heads up to the folks at home, feel free to send me notes or questions you have for me or Mark in the chat box during the show, and we're going to get to a few at the end. All right, so Mark, I know you've spoken about this case many times over the years. Has there ever been a case quite like this one before that's gone unsolved, lingering the way it does?
Well, there's certainly cases that we call the cases that haunt us. In fact, John and I wrote a book a number of years ago. Here's the hardcover version, out in paperback now, easily obtainable. So there are cases that for whatever reason just stay with us. And the Lindbergh kidnapping case, which was solved, but a lot of people think not solved appropriately. Certainly Jack the Ripper was a case like that. Probably the first serial killer case that most people are aware of. The Lizzie Borden case, which officially went unsolved. So yeah, there have been a bunch, but this one sort of had all of the elements. Anybody who remembers the case probably remembers all these viral videos of this 6-year-old beauty queen strutting her stuff like a Las Vegas showgirl and a cowgirl and Manhattan Sophisticate and Miss America and all of that. They remember that. They remember she's beautiful and blonde, and there you go. And this was a case about family. It was about wealth. It was about power and the power of lawyers. It was about truth versus the story. And it was a case that just absolutely went berserk. I remember when John and I were working on this case, I got a call. My phone number's unlisted, but I got a call from one of the major supermarket tabloids in the country, a name that you would all know, asking me to cover the case for them, since I had an inside edge on it. And I said, well, I don't think I can do that. They said, name your price. And I wanted to say, will you pay me enough so that I never have to work again? Because I don't know if I'd be able to work again after if I reported this case for you. But I didn't do it. But John and I have written about the case several times in this book, The Cases That Haunt Us, and then again in our book, Law and Disorder, which came out a couple of years ago. And Russ, this is one of those cases, unfortunately, of which there are many, where the story was better than the truth. And therefore, the story takes precedence over evidence. I think you're probably old enough to remember that movie with James Stewart, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Right.
Okay, well, in the end of the movie, the James Stewart character who has parlayed this erroneous notion that he shot Liberty Valance into, I think it was a United States senatorship. He says to the editor of the newspaper, are you going to tell what really happened. And the newspaper editor says something like, "This is the West, sir. When the truth becomes myth, print the myth."
Right.
So,
Right.
or the legend, print the legend. So
Print the legend, right?
yeah.
So look, so what is it about the death of a child, the murder of a child, that just rocks us all to our core?
Well, I think, first of all, it shows we're all vulnerable. This was a wealthy family. This was a protected family. This is a family that supposedly things were going right for. It happens the night after Christmas. The family is getting ready to take their private airplane up to Charlevoix, Michigan, where they have a summer home, and then they're taking the kids, JonBenet and her older brother Burke, on a Disney cruise in Florida. So this is like the perfect couple and the perfect family, and all of a sudden everything turns against them.
Just
and
shatter.
Not only do they lose their child, but they're accused of murdering the child.
Right.
And so this is the American dream turned instantly overnight into the American nightmare.
Right. So you've spent decades studying and writing about the criminal mind.
Yeah.
Before we get into the details of this particular case, tell me about the psychology of a person who could bring themselves to do something so devastating.
Well, first of all, we think of these criminals, particularly repeat predators or serial killers, as monsters. And on one level they are, but they're not like Hannibal Lecter. Nobody is like that. I mean, nobody's that smart. And if they were that smart, they'd find something else to do other than become a killer. But these are people who are not like us in other ways. We may look through them. They may have superficial charm. They may be able to get by in society. Oftentimes they're married and they have children, but they lack something that we all do. First of all, they lack impulse control, and then they lack empathy. They don't think of other people as real people. They are just objects to be used. So that's really the essence of the criminal mind. And, speaking in general terms, what we find over and over again with serial killers and repeat predators is there's two things warring within their psyche. One is this deep-seated sense of inadequacy, that they're just not good enough, that nothing's going their way. Warring with this is a sense that the rules don't apply to them. They have this entitlement that they're smarter than other people, that they're compensating in that way, and that they're entitled to things that other people aren't, and that the rules of society don't apply to them. And when you triangulate this with a sense of resentment, entitlement and resentment at the same time, that they're not getting the breaks in society, that they're not getting the girls, they're not getting the job, they're not getting the prestige, the money, whatever. And that's really what's going on inside them. And most of them have a pretty bad background to begin with too.
Right. I mean, it's interesting the way you say that. The three pillars of the triangle. So on the one hand, it's entitlement and superiority complex.
Right.
Then on the other peg is this inadequacy complex. And then I guess that third peg is this resentment complex.
Yeah.
And so I guess that really kind of, in this, and I think we talked about this last time, and, and as you guys covered in Mindhunter, and it was, I apologize if I'm misquoting the title of the book that you referenced in Mindhunter was Inside the Criminal Mind, I think it is.
Yeah.
Right.
The Criminal Mind, written by a good friend of ours, a forensic psychologist named Dr. Stanton Samino. And one of our favorite quotes from him is, when you talk about these people who've been incarcerated, and you talk about the possibility of rehabilitation for these violent predators.
Right, it's a composite.
And what he says is, before you can rehabilitate somebody, you've got to know you can't rehabilitate someone who hasn't been habilitated in the first place.
Right, because their minds, right? And you guys wrote about this extensively, and so does he, that this type of criminal mind simply doesn't function the way
No.
everyone, like quote unquote, normal person's brain functions. They're
No.
just,
And the other
they're
thing,
different animals, right?
yeah, and the other thing I would add, and Dennis Rader, the BTK strangler of Wichita, Kansas, is a perfect example of this. They may have a job, they may have a wife, they may have a home life, they may have children, and in his case, he was even president of his church. And yet the crimes, the serial killings, these sadistic murders were still the most important thing in his life.
Right.
This is what he lived for. This was it. This is what gave him his sense of identity, his sense of satisfaction. And it's what ultimately brought him down, because even though he knew he couldn't just come out and say, hey, I'm the BTK strangler, he still had the need to communicate with the media anonymously, to communicate with the police and get recognition, because that's what he wanted, recognition. A lot of these guys are police wannabes who haven't made it
Right.
there, so they don't get to exercise that kind of power. So they exercise it in other ways.
So is that, so, I mean, I may be a little bit inelegant in the way I describe it, but it sort of seems like, you know, so if this impulse to commit these terrible crimes is kind of their overriding modus operandi, but their, let's say their day job or their regular life is it sort of, is it just a mask for their other half, or is it sort of like, is
Well,
it just, or are they just bifurcated? Are they just two people at
in
once?
many cases it is.
Right.
It's the way they get along in life, but it's not the most important thing to them.
Right. Okay. So let's dive into it a little bit. It's 1996. So JonBenet Ramsey was a precocious little girl whose parents had her enrolled in these junior beauty pageants, which unto itself sort of raised, and especially now, when we look through the lens of a 2021 lens, but even for back then, the questions about who might have killed her, you know, does the, you know, that sort of putting a child in this sort of, you know, beauty, you know, sexualizing a child, does that have anything to do with what might have led to her murder, or is it sort of, are they completely unrelated?
Well, no, that's a very good question. It's exactly on point, Russ. In fact, Detective Lou Smith, who was this legendary detective from Colorado Springs, who'd solved probably 90 or 100 homicides on his own, had a 90% clearance record. He was a living legend.
Whoa.
He was retired at this point, and he was brought in by the Boulder County District Attorney Alex Hunter to try to make some sense of the case. And he certainly believed that. He believed that while everybody else in the media and the police and everything was saying it was either one or both of the parents who did it, Lou Smith had agreed with John Douglas, who was brought into the case, and I sort of came with him. And Lou said that, no, this was probably somebody who saw her in this beauty contest and had some kind of fixation about her. John and I don't necessarily agree with that interpretation, though it's certainly a possibility. But the one thing that Lou Smith and John and I definitely agree on is it was an intruder. And we took a lot of heat from a lot of people. We were on a lot of shows and really got beaten up on our insistence that it was not the parents, when everybody, including the FBI, was saying it was. But we still maintain that, and you know, we can go into
let's do that now.
Into that, we can talk about why we came to that conclusion.
All right, so I've got some images here. I'm gonna share a couple, and
Okay.
let's see where this takes us. Hang on a second. All right, sharing the screen, and okay. All right, so the case. All right, so we got the parents here.
Yeah.
So tell me about, so let's start with the parents.
This image takes place shortly after the murder, and John and Patricia Ramsey, known as Patsy, the parents. John, I believe, was 53 at the time. Patsy, who was his second wife, was 3 days short of her 40th birthday, as I recall. And they went on television and with, I believe it was Brian Cabell of CNN, who incidentally I went to college with.
Oh, did you really?
just totally coincidentally.
Oh, okay.
And Patsy said, there's somebody out there, keep your babies close to you, keep them safe, give us any information you have. And this was largely perceived as an exercise in deflecting guilt or association away from them.
Right. Actually, so before we dive in, and I should have done this before, so take us back to talk to me about the scene. Who found the body? What was going on? How was she killed? Like, just go into the details a little bit.
Let's start with point A and we'll get to point Z. And this is the way we analyze it, Russ, which is we say, all right, where do we start from? And we know where we ended up. What had to happen to get us there? So Christmas Day, the Ramseys had a lovely Christmas. The Christmas was a very important holiday to them. They got up early. The kids got up, opened their Christmas presents. John and Patsy took still pictures and movies of them. They spent the day at home. About 4 o'clock, they drive over to their good friends, Fleet and Priscilla White, who live about 6 blocks away. They have dinner with them. They stay till about 8:30. They then stop 2 other places to deliver Christmas gifts. JonBenet, who's 6 years old, falls asleep in the car. They carry her upstairs. Patsy undresses her and puts her in bed. John goes to Burke's bedroom. He had gotten some kind of toy, I believe, for Christmas that he wanted John to help him put together. He goes to sleep then. John sets his alarm for 5:30 in the morning because he's got his private plane and private pilot waiting at the Boulder airport to fly them to Charlevoix, Michigan, which is where they have their summer home. They're going to stop in Minneapolis on the way to pick up John's adult son and daughter, and the daughter's fiance. These are from his first marriage. I should also mention that I think about 5 years before, John's oldest daughter, Beth, had been killed in an automobile accident.
Oh,
and
geez.
John had gone into a deep depression about this. And he said only his religious faith had finally gotten him out of it. So they're planning on flying to Charlevoix, Michigan with the 2 older kids and the fiance. And then they're going to spend some time there. Then the older kids are going to go home, and John and Patsy and JonBenet and Burke are going to fly down to Miami, and they're going to take a week cruise on the Disney Big Red Boat.
So
they're all looking forward to that.
Right. So just to understand, so the kids, so JonBenet was 6, but Burke was how old at this time?
I think about 8.
Oh, 8. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I thought he was older. Okay.
Yeah, I think about 8 or 9, as I recall.
Okay.
I'm sure one of our listeners will look it up and tell us. So, in any event, Patsy comes down in the morning to make breakfast.
And this is the day after Christmas.
Yeah, this is about 5:30 in the morning because they have to get ready, and she's probably frazzled by having to get ready and get everybody out. And she comes down. The house is it's been built on. It's a Tudor style house that's been built on several times. So John and Patsy's room was actually a converted attic, and they came down, and then they had 2 staircases, a main one, and then a spiral staircase, which led down into the kitchen and then into the basement. So Patsy comes down the spiral staircase, and before she gets to the bottom rung, she sees 3 pages that look like they're from a legal pad. And that's the famous ransom note. She reads it, she panics, she goes, okay, he was not all right, Andrew Cogley says that Burke was 9. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, good. And so she runs up to JonBenet's room. JonBenet's not there. She panics, or claims she panics. She calls 911. We have a recording of the 911 call. We reproduce it in our books. And it's almost incoherent when she talks about her her daughter's missing and she's been kidnapped. They send an officer over to the house. Eventually, several officers come over. Eventually, their friends come over. And this is where the whole thing starts to go awry, because if you've got a supposed kidnapping, we can go over the note. It's really weird. We could even read it if you want. It's a totally unusual note, 3 pages long, and it asks for a very odd sum of money, $118,000 in $100 bills and then 50s and 20s, which it says for John to take out of his account. So eventually this scene, so theoretically, the whole house should be a crime scene because this is kidnapping. It's totally trampled by all of these police officers, by friends of the Ramseys who come over, by their pastor, by the Ramseys themselves. When Burke wakes up, I guess about 8 o'clock in the morning, they decide they don't want him to see what's going on. They tell him his sister is missing, but that's all. They send him with Fleet and Priscilla White to their house so that he won't be part of all this, which is a little odd when you think about it, because he might have been a target as well. But they do, and eventually they keep waiting for this phone call, which is supposed to come between 10 and 12 with the ransom demands and specifics. But what John doesn't know when this note was written, so he thinks, well, maybe it's today, maybe they meant tomorrow, 10 to 12. So he's not sure. In any event, the telephone call never comes, and Linda Arndt, who is the detective on duty at the time, who, according to all accounts, was very sympathetic to the Ramseys, trying to give him something to do. Fleet White has come back to the house, and she says, "Why don't you and Fleet go look around the house and see if you can find anything that looks useful to us."
At this point, is it still filled with all these people who had milled over?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So, and in one of the sitting rooms, Patsy is there with a number of her women friends who are trying to console her, and she's just beside herself. So John and Fleet go downstairs and start looking around, and in what is the last room in this basement warren, they called it the wine room, even though they were just light drinkers because they kept some wine down there. It's the last room in the basement, and John turns on the light switch, and there he sees JonBenet lying there prone with a blanket half over her. Her hands are over her head. The hands are bound. There's duct tape on her mouth.
Oh my God.
When he gets close, he sees that there's a ligature, a rope ligature around her neck.
Right.
He immediately rips off the tape. He tries to undo the ligature, but it's too tight. He talks to her. He tries to see what he can do. He carries her upstairs. Now, it's interesting to note at this point, she's in full rigor mortis.
Right.
So he basically carries her upright, carries her into the living room where the detective and some of the friends are, lays her on the floor. And Detective Linda Arndt looks at her closely, determines that she's dead. They tell Patsy is beside herself. And at that point, the case goes from being a kidnapping to a homicide.
Wow. So let's just take a second for there. So there's a lot of stuff going on in a very short time.
There is.
Right. So there's a ransom note.
Yes.
And an
it's a very odd ransom
and
note.
an odd one at that.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of people milling about. Now, from police procedure, is that typical that they would allow that many people?
Totally untypical. But you have to remember, this is a very low risk neighborhood.
Right.
It's a low crime city. It's an affluent university town. It's where the University of Colorado is.
Right.
They average 1 homicide a year and no kidnappings.
Right.
They don't have a lot of experience managing a case like this.
Right.
Keep in mind also, Russ, this is the day after Christmas. Most of the key people are on vacation.
Wow.
But now what's interesting is they are offered the services of the FBI, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and the
Right.
Denver Police Department. They
Right.
say, no, we can take care of this. We don't need any of that.
Real, they real.
And that was probably their second mistake.
Wow. Wait, so
Yeah.
this high, I mean, even at the time, if it wasn't high profile yet, because the media hadn't taken over. I mean,
Right.
this is not a breaking and entering.
Now, also, there's a statistical element to this too, which becomes very important, which is that statistically, cases that happen to children that are murdered in their homes,
Right.
statistically, the chances are very, very great that this is an inside job, that this is
Right.
either a parent or a relative of some sort. And the lower the age of the child, the greater the chance that this is a parent or an inside job.
Wow.
So the police and the media, once they find out, are predisposed to believing that this must have been the parents. And of course, this is a great story because
Sure.
this doesn't happen that often. And then when somebody gets a hold of these videos, which are actually amateur videos of these pageants, basically they were sold to parents and grandparents. But
Right.
when these go viral, the case explodes
Oh,
to
right.
a worldwide phenomenon.
So the optics are just, if you
The optics are
horrible.
spectacular and horrible. Yes.
Right. So you've got this, it's an affluent, it's a white, affluent,
Right.
quote unquote, safe, idyllic
Right.
community.
And the kid is gorgeous.
The kid is gorgeous and precocious.
Yes.
And there's a ransom note and a weird one and
Yep.
a horrible crime. And then these videos go out. And
Right.
then, this is even pre-Twitter when things could go. It went
Right.
viral before there was really viral the way we know it.
This is just the very, very beginnings of the internet. But
Right.
still, it's all over the media,
Right.
all
So
over the world.
did at any point, was there a connection because his daughter, he had one daughter who was killed in a car accident.
Mhm.
Was there a link that says, lightning rarely strikes twice? Was there sort of?
No, there wasn't actually, but it only became an issue later in terms of how upset was John Ramsey, because he seemed to be in control. He seemed to be
Holding it together.
stoic throughout the whole thing. He didn't break up and fall apart like his wife did.
Right.
But the one thing we've learned is everybody reacts differently. This was a business executive who was used to controlling things. He was used to having to put on a very stoic front.
Right.
And he knew that in crisis situations, the calmer you are, the better you do. I mean, going back to 1932, to the Lindbergh case, when Charles Lindbergh's baby son was kidnapped, everybody said that, he wasn't showing the right emotion. He was very controlled. He was very stoic. But when you think about it, this is a guy who'd done what nobody else had done. He'd flown across the Atlantic Ocean by himself in a one-engine plane.
Right.
And he knew if you don't stay calm and you don't stay in control, you die.
Right. You gotta have to have icicles in your veins to sort of keep
Right.
that going. So it starts to explode, and clearly the narrative is not looking good for
Looking
the
very
parents.
bad.
So what did it do to them?
Well, I mean, it devastated them. And the prevailing theory from the police, to a certain extent from the prosecutor's office, and certainly from the media, was, okay, these parents killed their kid either on purpose or by accident, and then staged it to look like a kidnapping or like a rape, murder, or rape that went bad, and they're trying to protect themselves.
What was the actual cause of death?
Well, this is now you're getting into some really interesting stuff. The medical examiner, who was highly qualified, he was board certified in 3 or 4 different specialties, and he said the cause of death was asphyxiation compounded with blunt force trauma to the head. So in other words, there was this garrote around her neck,
Right.
which was, and the fulcrum point for it was a piece that was broken off from Patsy Ramsey's paint box, which was in the basement. So near where the body was found. So that was another thing that tended to implicate her, along with the fact that the ransom note itself, we know, was written on a pad of paper that Patsy Ramsey used herself in the kitchen near the telephone.
Wow.
Okay. So this is not looking good.
No.
And so there's ligature strangulation, and all of the things that go with it, I mean, are found in the medical exam. There's petechial hemorrhaging under the eyelids. There is petechial hemorrhaging on the anterior side of the heart. And this looks very bad. Now, there's also blunt force trauma, which is she's found like with an 8.5-inch crack in her skull, and
Right.
Bruising and hemorrhaging underneath that, and then contusions to the brain itself. They said this was delivered with enough force to bring down a 300-pound man. I think
Wow.
JonBenet weighed about 40 pounds at the time.
So I mean, someone really, they just
So this now, and the speculation was from the medical examiner and some of the police officers that this blunt force trauma probably was with an object like either a golf club or a big flashlight, both of which are found in the house. Now, but that's not what Steve Thomas, who became the lead detective on the case, that's not what he thought. He thought it was blunt force trauma, but what he thought had happened was, do you want to get into this now, Russ?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. What he thought had happened is there had been some kind of argument between JonBenet and Patsy, probably over her constant bedwetting, and she was known as a very frequent bedwetter. Right. So Steve Thomas's theory is that Patsy, being so frazzled.
I'm sorry, and Steve Thomas, he's
the lead detective. He's the lead detective for the Boulder Police Department.
Okay.
And he eventually writes a book about the case. And he propounds the theory. His theory is that Patsy comes into JonBenet's room, finds that she's wet the bed yet again. She can't take it anymore. She drags her into the bathroom to clean her up, and in some kind of probably some kind of rage, momentary rage, accidentally smacks her harder than she intended, sends JonBenet into like a hard surface, probably like the edge of the toilet, the edge of the bathtub, something like that, cracks her skull, and then panics. And then she tells, and rather than call 911, she tells her husband, John, what's happened. She says, I think she's dead, and we better do something to make it look like we didn't do it. And it sounds strange when I'm telling you, but this was the prevailing thought throughout the world, including much of the law enforcement community and the FBI's behavioral science unit.
So both from a medical standpoint, and from a lack of a better, from a forensic standpoint, theoretically, let's just say she says, okay, I got upset with you, I lost my temper, I slapped you, and then you cracked your head. Could that have been the cause, or was that ruled out from a forensics and medical standpoint?
Well, it was not ruled out. The police certainly believed it. John and I ruled it out, and I'll tell you why. First of all, the wound to the head is much more consistent with a blow from an object than contact with a hard surface.
Right.
I mean, the kind of crack looks much more like she was struck with something.
Right.
All right. But now here's the key. Here's the key to the whole case right here, in my opinion. If you take the entire crime scene from her bedroom, which is on the second floor, I think, down the spiral staircase to the kitchen, down another spiral staircase to the basement, through several basement rooms, and into this final room that they call the wine room.
Right.
So that's our crime scene, right? Now that we know, because we take this from where JonBenet begins this
Right.
and where she ends up. Okay, now through this whole crime scene, this whole route that I've just described, they find approximately a teaspoon to a tablespoon worth of blood. That's it. Now, I can tell you, I've seen a lot of cases of blunt force trauma. I've never seen one where the skull, the facial area and the skull are extremely vascular. They bleed a lot. I don't know if you ever had a head wound, even if it's not serious.
And it bleeds.
It usually bleeds a lot.
Right.
So where's all the blood? Tell me that.
Right. Right. It just doesn't pass the sniff test, really.
It doesn't pass the test. So the only thing that makes sense is what she died of is this ligature strangulation, which is consistent with the medical findings, and the blunt force trauma to the head was probably delivered either post-mortem or peri-mortem, so that just to make sure she was dead. Because
Right.
how else could there be no blood from an 8.5-inch fracture? The
Right.
only way this can happen
If her
is if
heart
there's
stops.
no blood pressure or there's very, very low blood pressure.
Right. Right. She was
Now,
on her way out, or there was no
right.
blood flow at all.
Okay, so now let's dive down a little deeper into this.
All right. Let's go.
Do you have children, Russ?
I have two.
Okay. I don't have children, but can you imagine in a fit of wild rage, in your worst nightmare, striking one of your children harder than you wanted to and having that child fall or hit something? I mean, it's a nightmare, but you can imagine it.
Sure.
Right? Okay. Can you imagine slowly and methodically putting a rope around your child's neck and slowly twisting it till the child blacks out and then dies? That's not something any parent could do under any circumstances. It's not spontaneous.
Right.
It's willful.
Right.
It's planned. It's
Right.
organized. It's not an accident.
Right. This is a premeditated. You thought about this.
And so behaviorally, none of us can imagine this scenario. So the only way either of the parents could have done it is if the blunt force trauma was the cause of the death, which it clearly was not. Now let's back up a minute and say, okay, well, what if John did it? What if he's really a pervert? What if he's got these weird sexual ideas with his kid, and he's done this, and this is actually autoerotic asphyxiation as part of some kind of weird sexual act or ritual with his 6-year-old daughter. And we do find some abrasions in and around her vagina, and there's a small amount of blood on the crotch of her panties. So, so there's some kind of probably digital penetration there. So, what if John did this and Patsy, was either part of it, or she can't give him up because that's her means of support, et cetera, et cetera. But first of all, you've got to, one rule we go by in behavioral science, and it's almost always ironclad, is past behavior predicts future behavior. Everybody looked into everything about John and Patsy Ramsey. And not only the police, not only the press, but the tabloid press. And believe me, they had no compunction about spilling anything. Sure. Nobody could find one instance of anything either weird, cruel, or strict about John or Patsy Ramsey. Even John's former wife, who he divorced, said that he was a great father. These are parents who never hit their children, never spanked their children, any of them, and yet suddenly they're going to do something like this. It doesn't work.
Right.
You don't just suddenly evolve into a vicious killer. There has to be some kind of evolution. It doesn't happen overnight, and then you don't suddenly figure out how to cover it up. So, you know, these would people, if they had done this, I mean, if they had killed their child by accident, say, in a moment of crisis, there's no way two ordinary upper middle class people could have figured out this elaborate scheme.
It's too organized.
And then set out to write this weird 3-page ransom letter. It doesn't make any sense. None of this adds up to anybody inside the family.
Right. So let's talk about this. So what happened with the brother? Let's talk about him. How was he treated?
Okay. The brother, at first, you know, people didn't think much about him. And then you know, he's interviewed by the police. They don't find much. Then and then suddenly this sort of cultish followers of the case start to take over, and they say, well, maybe Burke did it. You know, he woke up in the middle of the night. He was jealous of JonBenet because of all the attention she got from the beauty contest. He was kind of awkward. She was more poised and much more outgoing. And maybe they had an argument about something, and he hit her harder than he wanted to with something, and then panicked. And the parents figured, we've lost one of our children now. We better protect the other by staging this to look like some kind of intruder with both a kidnapping scheme and some kind of sexual perversion. Now, that doesn't work for several reasons. First of all, Burke is 9. It's very, you know, first, how does he get her out of the bedroom? Where's the blood? And then, first of all, if this had happened, wouldn't you think that the parents' first instinct would be quickly call 911 and see what happened? They know their son's not going to be arrested or, you know, tried. I mean, he's 9 years old.
And what 9-year-old would have the strength?
Exactly. Right. But here's another behavioral indicator. Let's say Burke had done it, and John and Patsy knew that. Okay. Now, what's the first thing they do when they say he wakes up? They tell him that his sister is missing, or that's what they say. So you believe that or not. But then the established fact is they send him to Fleet and Patricia White's house so that he'll be away from all this turmoil. Now, this is a 9-year-old who is already traumatized. And if he killed his sister, he's really traumatized.
Right.
So if you're the parents and you're trying to protect him, knowing what 9-year-old kids talk about and how, are you going to let him out of your sight, much less let him be interviewed by the police on his own or sent somewhere else? Of course not. I mean, this makes no sense.
So let's talk about this. I got a couple more images I want to share about some other folks who kind of got involved in this. So as time went along, beyond the family, there was a sense of, well, all right, who might have been involved, right? Mm-hmm. So there was a Santa, mm-hmm. right, and there was I think there was a drifter here, and there was a couple of folks involved. So talk to me about some of these folks here.
Well, there's a number of suspects, as you've shown, and some of them it just doesn't add up. The one that they called Santa Claus, who had been at a number of their parties, it would have been very difficult for him to get into the house. I mean, there was no motive. there was a couple of people, I don't want to mention names because one of them is deceased and another one has denied it, but there were possibilities of people who their significant others had talked a lot about the case. One of them didn't have an alibi for where he was and eventually committed suicide. So there are other possibilities, but I'm not going to speculate on who did it because we don't really have enough evidence or that we are privy to. What I'm concentrating on is that this rush to judgment, this media frenzy, was based on no evidence. In fact, it was based on suppositions that were contrary to the evidence. And again, the story that the point that I keep trying to make, and we've talked about this before, Russ, this was true in the Ramsey case, in the West Memphis 3 case, which we've written about, also in Law and Disorder, the Amanda Knox case in Italy.
Right.
The lesson here is, and you can apply this to current presidential politics if you want to. The lesson here is when the story that's put out is better than the truth, better than what really happened, evidence has very little chance because the story takes precedence and the story is what sounds interesting. I mean, I said to Amanda Knox, for instance, I said, you're a writer now, Amanda, you tell me, what's a better story? Two beautiful roommates, one from America, one from England. They get into this drug-crazed freak out with satanic overtones and this sex orgy. And one of them, and one of these beautiful girls, with the help of her boyfriend and another guy, ends up stabbing her friend and roommate to death with multiple stab wounds to the chest and neck. I said, how do you like that story compared to somebody with a known history of break-ins and enterings, carrying a knife? He breaks into a house, he's surprised by somebody else who comes in. He realizes she's seen him, he has to confront her. He takes sexual advantage of her while he's neutralizing her. Then he kills her, steals her credit cards and her phone and leaves. I mean, which is a better story?
Right.
One's the truth and the other is a great story.
Right. So just a quick interlude for folks who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments from me or Mark, send it in the chat box and we'll get to the few in a couple of minutes. So I got another question for you. So as we're coming towards the end here. So the case was sort of mishandled on a lot of levels from the beginning.
Correct.
At what point, or was there a point where, whether it was John Douglas or let's just call it, the big guys, the big guns came in, did they come in and say, stop, what you guys did is X. This is how we really look about, this is how we handle a case like this. And did you start sort of checking, either eliminating, going through evidence and you eliminated possibilities to the point where—
This is what Lou Smith did. This is what Detective Lou Smith did. And what he did is he actually showed with evidence what John Douglas had figured out behaviorally. I should tell you, John was hired by John Ramsey's lawyers basically to see whether he thought their client had done it. Once he became convinced that their client had not done it, he wouldn't take any fees. And he said, look, now I have to help you exonerate these people because I believe that they are innocent. Lou Smith eventually quit the case because he thought if he was being railroaded into saying that they were guilty when they were not. So yes, Lou Smith came in, and if you'd had these people in from the beginning, before the crime scene was compromised,
right,
I think the case was solvable. Now it would have to be something that comes up incidentally, a deathbed confession,
right,
somebody who was told something. Now, to show you how you can be led astray, one of the images you showed was a guy named John Mark Carr,
hold on. I'll bring this up again. Hold on. So you can tell me which one we're looking at here. Sorry. Oh,
Yeah.
just give me 1 second.
Sure.
I closed out my file. All right. So John Mark Carr. He. Oh, here it is. I got it. Okay. Whoops.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Here we go. Okay. So John Mark Carr.
Okay. I think you're actually promoting our books now, but that's okay.
Oh, sorry. Oh, do I have the wrong? Oh, I got the wrong one. Sorry. Oh.
That's okay.
All right. I'll get it. Go ahead.
But we've seen enough of him. But anyway,
Okay.
so John Mark Carr is he's this weird guy. He's a teacher.
Is this him? Him right here?
So yeah.
Okay.
He's a teacher. He starts corresponding with a professor in Colorado, and he shows all kinds of evidence or implications that he's involved. He's clearly obsessed with JonBenet. He says that he was with her when she died, and then he's traced to Thailand, where he's teaching in a school for children. And he's clearly obsessed with young children, mostly little girls. When they ask him if he was with JonBenet when she died, he says yes. He says he was in love with her and then he says when they say, "Are you innocent?" He says no. Now this guy's very weird, but so the then Boulder District Attorney, who has taken over from Alex Hunter at this point, sends an arrest warrant to Thailand and wants to have him extradited. He's extradited back to Colorado, and John and I think, okay, they finally got the guy. Now, why did we think that? First of all, he's an outsider.
Right.
He's kind of admitted it. He's obsessed with this little girl and her beauty. And, he certainly would fit the profile. However, that's not why we thought he had done it. We were taken in just like everybody else. The reason we thought he had done it was we thought the Boulder District Attorney and the police department had made so many mistakes in the past, had looked so bad, that there's no possibility that they would extradite this guy all the way from Thailand
Unless they knew.
Unless they had him dead to rights. I mean, they wouldn't take a chance on looking foolish again. So they get him back. He spouts all kinds of things. He seems to enjoy the plane ride back. He talks to federal marshals along the way. They get him back, and they get a DNA sample to match against the DNA found in JonBenet's underpants and on her leggings, which, by the way, adhered to nobody in the family or in any of the friends.
Right.
Guess what? John Mark Carr's DNA doesn't fit either.
Right.
They dropped the case against him.
Right.
We couldn't believe it.
So why, in a case like this, just all these incredible circumstances, at what point did the local law enforcement say, you know what, we're in over our head, maybe we should turn this over to the
yeah, unfortunately that didn't happen, or it didn't happen until it was too late. In fact, this guy, I'm not going to say anything bad about him, but Steve Thomas, the detective, he wasn't a homicide detective. They didn't have enough homicides in Boulder to have a homicide department.
Right.
He was a narcotics detective, and in a college town, narcotics detectives get a lot of work. And what's the difference between a homicide detective and a narcotics detective? Well, one thing is a homicide detective usually has to figure out who killed somebody, and somebody who wasn't expecting to be killed.
Right.
And if you don't know who the suspect is, narcotics detectives pretty much know who the actors are.
Mm-hmm. What
they have to do is make their case.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a completely different mindset,
Mm-hmm.
I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So, this is just, the problem is these guys didn't have enough experience. And the way John Douglas describes it is, he says, when you go to your regular doctor, whether he's a general practitioner, an internist or whatever, he takes care of most of the things that are wrong with you. If you have something really exotic, something that he doesn't
Calling the
see every
specialist.
day, he's going to send in a specialist. I mean, if you need heart surgery, your regular doctor is not
Your
gonna do
GP is
heart
not doing it.
surgery. No, your general practitioner is not going to do it. You're going to get the best cardiothoracic surgeon you can find who's done hundreds of these. So this is the same thing. I mean, you either call in Denver PD, which has an active homicide department, you call in the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, or you call in the FBI. People in John Douglas's unit, they specialize in this kind of thing. They've seen it all over. And yet this was their case. They thought they could solve it on their own. And within the first day, as I say, the scene was so compromised that evidence was useless except for the body itself. Now, let's say one other thing from a behavioral standpoint.
Okay.
When parents kill their children, when spouses kill their spouse, there's usually a pattern to this, which is since they are the first ones that are looked at by the police, they need to establish some kind of alibi or indirection. So what would happen is, traditionally, if you stage a crime scene to make it look like something else because you've killed your spouse or your kid or whatever, you're going to want to be away from the house. You're going to want to establish that you've called the house several times trying to get through and you can't. You ask a neighbor or somebody to go look in the house, and they're the ones who discover the body, and then they call you or the police call you and you're shocked. Okay, so what happens in this case? Let's say John or Patsy together staged this crime scene in the basement, this autoerotic asphyxiation and the blunt force trauma to the head, whatever. They put the duct tape on. What's the first thing that John does when he sees his daughter down there? First thing he does is he rips off, first of all, he finds her himself.
Right.
He doesn't say, Fleet, why don't you go look in that room and and I'll look in this part of the basement. First thing he does, he sees her. Fleet he says, oh my God, or something like that. Then he rips off the duct tape on her mouth, and he tries to rip off the ligature around her neck, but he can't do it. So, and then he carries her upstairs. So my question is, if he has staged this scene, why does he unstage it before anybody else gets to see it?
Right.
That makes no sense.
You're right.
Makes no criminal sense. And, what can I say about that?
Yeah. All right. Look, that was great. So I want to take a couple of questions from the audience.
Sure.
So one's coming in from, we have John French, who's an author and actually former CSI, Baltimore CSI.
All right.
He asked, was there a point of entry found? And what about latent prints that did not belong to family members?
Yeah. But there were no latent prints found that were of any use. I mean, there were prints all over the house. Point of entry is, there's several possibilities. Lou Smith, there was a broken window in a window well in the basement. Now that looks like an obvious break-in point, but when they asked John about it, he said, oh no, he easily could have said, oh wow, yeah, that's how they must have gotten in. Instead, he says, no, I broke that window a couple of months ago. I didn't have my keys and nobody else was home, and I had to do it to get in, and we just never got around to fixing it. Lou Smith showed that you could easily get in through that. You could use that broken window to open the casement window. No, it was I don't think they were casement windows. They went like this to get into the window well and land on a suitcase, and then from there to the floor. So that's what Lou Smith thought. There were also 6 doors on the first floor of the house, and one of them, the back door, was found to be unlocked. This was not unusual. This was a very low crime neighborhood. The Ramseys did not lock their doors all the time. Moreover, they could enumerate 20 keys to the house that they were not in control of, that had been given to housekeepers, babysitters, things like that. So there were a number of ways that entry could have been gained. Again, Lou Smith thought it was through this window well. It could have been through an open back door, or it could have been through a key.
Right. So another question is, do the specifics match any of the murders at that time? I.e., was this a serial crime here?
Doesn't seem to be. Does not seem to be. John speculated, actually both Johns, John Douglas and John Ramsey, both speculated that this was somebody who had a grudge against him. There were a number of people who did have grudges against him at Access Graphics, the company that he headed. Either they'd been fired or they didn't think they'd had good business deals. So I tended to think that while it was in an Intruder, when I looked at the ransom note, I saw there were a lot of topical references. There were references to movies that were out at the time, Speed, a Dirty Harry movie. I don't remember what else. There were several of them with phrases that came almost word for word from movies. There were lines like, if you don't, one of them was Ransom, a Mel Gibson movie. I mean, almost word for word from that. So there were lines like, if you do not comply, your daughter will be beheaded. And when I was talking to the detectives, they said, well, that's pretty archaic. That must be an older adult. And I said, no, it's not. I said, that's somebody who's watching Hercules or Xena Warrior Princess or plays Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. I said, this note seems to me to be written, the way it's written, it really seems to be a young person. Right. So what I speculate is that this really was a kidnapping gone bad. Now, what's very interesting is, again, the pad that the ransom note is written on is found in the house. It clearly belonged to Patsy, no question about it. The paintbrush handle that was used to twist the ligature tight definitely came from the house. The weapon that caused the blunt force trauma to the head, either a golf club or a flashlight, most likely came from the house. All right, now we're going to back up a minute. One of the things that Lou Smith found when he examined the autopsy photos, something nobody else had found before. He found two sets of lesions, just I don't know how far apart, but very close together. And they were identical to each other, except one was on her neck and one was on her back. And these were like two, almost like burn marks. And he looked at them closely and thought about it and talked to some people. And what they looked like to him, and he did complex measurements, they looked to him like, and he checked this out with experts, they looked to him like scars, bruises, whatever, from a stun gun, particularly a particular model, the Air Taser 34,000. I mean, they were identical to that. Wow. Now, they went to Air Taser, and Air Taser said, well, we can't say for sure without seeing the actual body, but the pictures look like it. Okay, now, so what's not found in the house when they do this complete search? All right, so the paintbrush, the golf club, the pad, flashlight, all found in the house. What's not found in the house? No stun gun, no roll of duct tape, and no spool of rope corresponding to what is the ligature around the neck.
So it implies that the killer had it with them, brought it.
Exactly. And what are those three items compared to the ones that were found in the house? Those are items of control, rather than items of murder. So in other words, I think the evidence shows that this really was a kidnapping or a kidnapping attempt. And I think the person who did it thought that, you hit her with the stun gun, get her downstairs, that'll be it. Didn't realize how difficult a kidnapping is. We see this over and over again. When we get to interview kidnappers, particularly of children, they tell us over and over again, I had no idea how difficult it would be to kidnap and control a 40-pound child.
Right. They think, oh, they're so small, I'll knock them out. No big deal.
Right. So, I mean, I think, I can't tell you who did it, but I think the evidence all points in this one direction. And people say, well, how could an intruder be in the house and be there for hours and hours? Well, guess what? We see burglars every day who stay in the house for hours at a time. I can't tell you how many times we have talked to women who wake up, in their beds and find a rapist standing over them who has been there for hours, just waiting for them to get home and fall asleep.
Right. And if your theory is, if it's correct, that let's just say it was someone who was out for revenge, maybe they'd been in the house before, they knew the layout of the house, they knew where to hide.
Russ, I think they almost would have had to have been in the house before. And guess what? The Ramseys' house had been on had been on a charity house tour of the neighborhood.
Right. So lots of people knew.
Anybody could have come in. Hundreds of people went through it.
Wow. All right. So that's your takeaway. So you think it was a intended kidnapping that just went south?
Yeah. I mean, again, John and John Ramsey think they've certainly allowed that I might possibly be right. They think it was somebody who was out to get revenge or punish John by taking the thing that was most precious to him. Right. And John, the Johns have allowed that I could be right, and I've certainly allowed that they could be right.
All right. Wow. Well, that was a fascinating story, and I want to thank you for taking us through that. But now let's shake that off, because it's time to spin the wheel, as we do on every show. Okay, on the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get, and the categories are: I need a drink, trick or treat, stranger in a strange land, Silence of the Lambs, fear of flying, music to my ears, and one of our latest ones, kick 'em in the junk. All right, you ready? Yeah. All right, whatever you get is what you play. All right, and we got stranger in a strange land. All right, so you've spent your career writing about crime and criminals.
Right.
Is there any other genre that you'd like to write in that you haven't dabbled in yet?
I would have done a little bit of it, but since you mentioned Stranger in a Strange Land, yeah, I'd like to do more science fiction. My first novel was called Einstein's Brain, and it was somewhat science fiction. I mean, it was kind of a historical novel, and it certainly had a science fiction neurological element to it. But as you know from talking to me previously, I was a great disciple of the late, great Rod Serling, of the Twilight Zone fame, who really took me under his wing as a young man and really taught me and inspired me. So yes, I would love to write more science fiction and dabble in that strange land.
All right, you write it, I'll read it. All right, and last, and I have to ask because we all want to know, what's the word on Mindhunter season 3?
Well, yeah, I mean, the last we heard, David Fincher had said that he was involved in other projects, like the movie Mank that he did that took him 2 years. He's a very meticulous guy. Lately, we've heard that there may actually be a season 3, that David and Netflix are talking to each other about it. The show has a passionate following. Netflix may not have thought the following was big enough to justify the cost, but I can tell you the actors, Jonathan Groff and Holt McCallany, who John and I have become close friends with, they would both love to continue doing the show. Many of our fans would like to do so. So, let's hope. That's all right. I can say.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for that. So, John, before we go, Mark, before we go, let's, I know you've got a new book out, so give me a second and we will, you'll tell us what you got here. So
yeah, our latest book is called The Killer's Shadow, the FBI's hunt for a white supremacist serial killer. Unfortunately, you might say, it is extremely relevant now with all of the white supremacy stuff going on. It's the story of the FBI's hunt for Joseph Paul Franklin, who was a serial killer who killed at least 22 people, maybe more.
Oh,
But
gee.
unlike most serial killers who kill for the sexual gratification, as we've been talking about before, this guy was mission oriented. He wanted to start a race war. He was from the South. He had been indoctrinated by Mein Kampf, by Adolf Hitler. He had joined the Ku Klux Klan, the National States Rights Party, the American Nazi Party, the National Socialist White People's Party. He was on a mission to foment a race war. And, wow. He killed African Americans, he killed Jews, and he killed mixed race couples because he didn't believe in race mixing. You also might remember him as the man who mortally wounded Hustler publisher Larry Flint and also civil rights leader Vernon Jordan, both of whom have died in the last not too long. And so this was a totally vicious man. We explain where his origins came, what blossomed him into a serial killer, how he finally left all of these hate groups and became a lone wolf, very mission oriented. Right. And unfortunately, even though he was executed, his shadow is long. The killer's shadow is long. People like Dylan Roof and the people in Charlottesville, these are his spiritual children. So the mission is still going on. And so one of the things that bothers us so much, I think one of the reasons this case affected John so deeply, he was involved with the hunt to find him. He did the fugitive assessment that finally brought him to justice. He did an extensive interview with him in prison in Marion Penitentiary before he was executed. And the thing that bothered John so much is, this is not, I mean, most serial killers, you know, they do what they do and people are interested in them, but they don't follow them. This is the kind of serial killer that the wrong kind of people would follow and be inspired by and take over from. And this is a really scary thing.
All right. Wow. Well, I mean, scary stuff, but I'm sure it'll be an incredible read and we'll all look out for that. As for me, so following up in tonight's a theme of crime and, as Mark had said, his own sci-fi origins. If sci-fi noir is more your game, I'll point you to my sci-fi mystery, Crackle and Fire.
I want to meet this girl on the cover, Russ.
All right, you got it. I'll set it up for you.
I'm sorry, woman. I'm showing my hand.
Okay.
I want to meet this woman on the cover.
All right, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, part Doctor Who, part Blade Runner, and part Philip Marlowe. Crackle and Fire is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And if you want a signed copy, you can get one from me directly. All right. Well, thanks for our show. This was absolutely fantastic. I want to thank Mark Olshaker for coming back on the show and walking us through one of the real crime, the most incredible.
Well, thank you, Russ. You always ask great questions and you always come totally prepared, which I really appreciate.
Well, it was fantastic, and hopefully we'll get you back on the show when your new book comes out. Thanks for everyone who's watching. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro, and I'll see you all next week. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.